to see you, John. Thank you. Well, when John first called with the invitation, I was so excited, I almost forgot to accept the charges. And then I've run into another problem. I didn't even think I could be here tonight because I'm recovering from an old football injury. I got it moving my television set, helping the Eagles get better field position. Where are my Philly boys? Are they here? Yes. Good. I'll tell these jokes a little slower. They understand. They understand. I'm a homeboy. In fact, I'm often asked to describe the typical Philadelphia sports fan because really the Philadelphia sports fans are more famous than the teams, more famous than the athletes and the coaches, for the very simple reason they have established a reputation as the booingest people in the entire world. There we go. I feel right at home. A typical Philadelphia sports fan is a guy who sits up at the third deck at the Vet, screaming and hollering invective down at the interior line judge for blowing an insignificant holding call right there in the middle of the line. And then this same fan goes out in the parking lot and can't find his car. That's the typical Philadelphia sports fan. But welcome to Orlando. We are really, really glad that you are here. I do give you one word of caution. It's very, very easy in this community to get Disneyized. I mean, it happens to people, even over a weekend. It's an insidious form of brainwashing that takes place, and you begin to think Disney thoughts, and you start talking their language. It's really weird. I was reminded of that at dinner last night as I was talking to my two oldest sons, Donald and Pluto, and I was sharing with them the same. As I travel across America, speaking to corporate America, you want to know what the number one topic, the number one request to talk about in corporate America is? And I don't care whether it's a Fortune 500 company or a mom-and-pop widget factory. The number one request is talk about teamwork. Interesting, isn't it? Talk about teamwork. Some years back, I became convinced that corporate America thinks that those of us in sports have all the answers about teamwork. In other words, what the Vince Lombardis and the John Woodens and the Red Auerbachs and the Phil Jacksons and all of these great coaches have done in putting teams together, can that be transferred into corporate America as well? Are those lessons the same? So I became very, very interested and fascinated with that, and I did an intensive amount of research and ended up writing a book called The Magic of Teamwork. And I came away convinced that everything that we have been doing in sports for all these years is absolutely transferable into the world that you live in corporate America, as well as the military or the education field or any endeavor which relies on teamwork, which is every endeavor, by the way. It all tucks back into what we're doing in sports. I want to share those 8 characteristics, those 8 qualities of great teams with you, because I think it can really make a difference in what you're doing in your professional world. Before I do that, I do need to point out that there are many different forms of teamwork existing out there in the world. I was back in the Philadelphia area about a year ago, and I went to the Philadelphia Zoo, kind of reviving childhood memories. And while I was touring through the zoo, I saw an amazing sight. It was called the Teamwork Exhibit. And as I looked through the cages there, I saw that inside the cage was a lion as well as a lamb. It was called the Teamwork Exhibit, and as I was walking out, I stopped the zookeeper and I said, "Sir, please explain to me how that exhibit works. He said, it's not very complicated. He said, every morning we put another lamb in there, he said. That is one form of teamwork, not the kind we want to dwell on this evening. John mentioned in his introduction the fact that I have slogged my way through a bunch of marathons, 26 in the last 6 years. They're not pretty. Now, by the time I get in, the Kenyans have finished, showered, eaten, and are heading back home. But I've got 4 hours more of memories of the whole event than they do. I was out training the other day in Winter Park, where we live. For many, many years, there has been a veterinarian shop right there on the main drag of Winter Park. But I noticed last week that adjoining it now is a taxidermist shop. And there's an awning that connects the two stores. And on the awning it says, either way, you get your pet back. That is another form of teamwork. Not the kind we want to dwell on tonight. John also mentioned that I have a radio show here in town. One of my guests a few years ago was Wes Unseld, the longtime NBA center, now the general manager of the Washington Wizards. And Wes was reminiscing on the air about growing up in Louisville, Kentucky. His next-door neighbor was a man named Charles. Charles and his wife had an interesting background. They had both been married previously. Each brought 5 children from their previous union, and then together they had 5 more children. And Wes said, I can still hear Charles' wife screaming through the neighborhood at night, Charles, your children and my children are beating up our children, said Wes. That's another form of teamwork, not the kind we want to dwell on tonight. As I was doing my research, I sent my outline out to many, many team builders across America, looking for their input, their advice, and their counsel. One of the men who responded to me was Dr. Jack Ramsey, the longtime NBA coach, now a broadcaster, member of the Basketball Hall of Fame. And Jack wrote a little note. He said, your stuff looks good, you're tracking well. He said, but you have forgotten the most important ingredient. You've got to have the talent, he said, to have a great team. So I completely redid my outline. I listened to the doctor, and that became the first quality of great teams. They have outstanding talent. John Wooden, the great UCLA coach, who, by the way, is still living, he's 93 years old, lives alone in an apartment in Encino, California, still sharp as a tack, 10 titles at UCLA. Think about it. There's a record that'll never be broken. He was asked the secret of his success at UCLA, and Coach Wooden said, talent, talent, talent. When pressed further, he said, I never wanted to go into a game with my opposition unless I had better players than they did. John said in his simple Midwestern style. Good advice, isn't it? Dennis Conner, the yachtsman, and understand yachtsmen speak in a little different language, was asked the secret of his success. He said, staffing, staffing, staffing. And 2 weeks ago at the NBA All-Star Weekend in Atlanta, Bill Russell was there reminiscing about the great success of the Celtics. Think about the Russell era, 11 titles in 13 years. And Bill Russell said, number 1, we had great ability. Number 2, we had great ability. Number 3, we had great ability. So as you are putting your teams together, may I make the very simple statement, you've got to have great talent. So in researching and investigating before you bring talent on your team, please research carefully, investigate, study. You can never do enough background checks. You can never do enough psychological testing. You can never do enough interviewing. You can never get enough references. You can't. My advice to any team is to hire very slowly. Take your time. When an opening comes on your team, don't just fill it to fill it, because the worst feeling in the world is after you fill a position, about 2 weeks later, people begin to come to you and say, you know that guy we hired 2 weeks ago? it really isn't working. Oh, that's not a good feeling, folks. That's a very, very, very ugly feeling. Take your time. Leave the position open if you have to till you get the right people. And then I also want to point out, fire quickly. If it's not working, the longer you wait, generally, the worse it gets. If you've got a problem on your team, if there's an issue with your talent, please make the move, hard as it is, and get on with it. I've been in the NBA now for 35 years. That's a long time. My first year was 1968, and I've been in it consecutively since then. Been part of many, many drafts. Now, the draft is the key to your whole ball club. If you draft well year after year, you're going to have success in our business. And so the night of the draft and all that time leading up to it is very interesting. I've been working with coaches from Jack Ramsey to Dick Motta, Cotton Fitzsimmons, Gene Shue, Billy Cunningham, Chuck Daly, Matt Gukas, Brian Hill, now Doc Rivers here with the Magic. And it is very, very interesting as we do the research and study and look at the tapes and really get to know these athletes. Every single draft for 35 years, at the moment of truth, these coaches always ask the same question, whether it's 1968 or 2003. And the question is about this kid we're about to draft and give millions of dollars with a guaranteed contract is, can I coach him? Will he listen to me? Will he respond to instruction? That's the question they all ask. Listen, if it's that important in our world, I want to tell you it's every bit as important in your world, so that you understand fully that you've got coachable people on your team. And then one other word of advice in putting a talented group together, please understand everybody's got a role. We would not be a very good team with 5 point guards. I was so thrilled that John put a team together with 2 different types of guards and power forwards, and he had a center and a sixth man. Good for John. And it goes in your world as well. It doesn't matter whether you are in the basketball business or the title insurance business, everybody's got to know their role. They've got to have their niche. And if you can pull this off in this whole area of talent, you've laid the foundation for a terrific team. However, there's a second quality about great teams that makes them successful, and that is they have outstanding leadership. Great teams have outstanding leadership. And I want to stay here for just a minute because this is a key subject. Everything rises and falls on leadership. It always has, and it always will. From the beginning of time, I mean, you can go back to the Garden of Eden, where leadership was the issue there. And ever since, that's been the case. It's very interesting to me that leadership has become basically an industry in our country. It started about 12 years ago when a man named Donald T. Phillips wrote a book called Lincoln on Leadership. That kind of triggered it. Then came the Founding Fathers on leadership. Then came Martin Luther King Jr. on leadership, books that Phillips wrote. Then a man named John Maxwell kicked in. He wrote a book called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. My good friend John Maxwell put that one together. And then all the books kept pouring beyond that. We suddenly got the Civil War people involved. Robert E. Lee on leadership, Grant on leadership, including one called Cigars, Whiskey, and Winning about Ulysses S. Grant. The biblical personalities, there are at least 6 books of Jesus on leadership, David on leadership, Moses on leadership, including one called Moses on Management. The World War II people got involved, Patton on leadership, Churchill on leadership, Eisenhower on leadership. It's amazing. And I want to tell you, you can't be in sports without a leadership book. Bobby Bowden on leadership, Dean Smith on leadership, Pat Summitt on leadership, Mike Krzyzewski on leadership, Joe Torre on leadership, Brian Billick, Mike Shanahan, Lou Holtz, Pat Riley. I mean, it's amazing. And I guarantee you there'll be a John Gruden book out this spring on leadership. Well, let me tell you 2 things, 2 pieces of good news. I can save you a lot of time, and I can save you a lot of money, because I've bought all those books, and I've read them all, and I've studied them, And I've combined my 41 years in professional sports with all of that, and guess what came out this winter? Another book on leadership, my take, called The Paradox of Power. And I'm convinced, and I have all the respect in the world for John Maxwell, there's 7 qualities of great leaders, 7 characteristics of great leaders. And I don't care whether you're leading in the basketball business, the military business, the real estate transaction business, the government business, it doesn't matter. 7 qualities of great leaders. Please listen carefully. Number 1, great leaders have vision. Great leaders have vision. It's the vision thing. Remember that term? George Bush the elder, number 41, had a successful run in Desert Storm. The 92 election is approaching. His handlers, I think, got to him and said, "Mr. Bush, you've got to talk about your vision to the American people." And at a press conference, he kind of flipped it off and referred to it as the vision thing. And by the way, the vision thing, I think, cost him the election. And we had a new word in the English language, a vision thing. When Roone Arledge died 4 or 5 weeks ago, the great pioneer in television sports, Barbara Walters said, "Roone had the vision thing down pat." The vision thing is the ability to see into the future, to see down the road, to see over the horizon. Bill Bradley, former senator, said that one of his greatest heroes was Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson. When asked why, Bill Bradley said because he had the ability to see around corners. He saw the future before it got here, said Bill Bradley. That's the vision thing. My wife, Ruth, teaches for the Franklin Covey Company how to use your Franklin Planner, how to get your life organized. Listen, with 19 children, it's not bad being married to the Franklin Planner lady. She's now teaching Stephen Covey's 7 Habits course. I've got to confess to you, I don't fully understand all 7 of the habits, but I got the second one nailed. That's the habit that says begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. In other words, a successful leader sees the finished product clearly in her mind and then works backwards, putting the pieces in place to bring it to reality. That's the vision thing. In fact, Dr. Warren Bennis put it this way. He said, leadership is the ability to turn vision into reality. I have discovered that a vision does 3 things for you as a leader. Number 1, it keeps you focused. When you have a vision, you're focused. It's like you have blinders on. You're honing in, you're zeroed in on what has to be done. And you're concentrating because that vision is so compelling in your life, you have total focus. By the way, the book that was in all of your gift bags, How to Be Like Mike, I took the 11 qualities of Michael Jordan that made him unique, far beyond his talent. 11 qualities that we can all learn from. You know what chapter 1 is about? His focus. I did over 1,500 interviews with former teammates, coaches, opponents, referees, trying to figure out how we can all be like Mike. In almost every interview, it always came back to Michael's focus. His living in the moment, concentrating on right now, blocking out distractions, and honing in on what was vital to him. So great leaders stay focused, and that's what a vision does for you. Secondly, a vision keeps you fueled. It gives you energy. It gives you enthusiasm. It gives you zip. That's what it does for you, because you're excited as a leader about what's going on. And folks, as leaders, if you're not excited, nobody else is going to be either. It transmits to everybody. And then thirdly, a vision helps you finish. It gets you to the finish line. I have noticed in every campaign, every building launch, every charitable endeavor, they always start beautifully. There's a big kickoff breakfast. There are balloons. There are cheerleaders. The team mascot comes out. The band is playing. Oh, there's such excitement about the launch. And every endeavor always ends with a victory banquet. You know, a celebration at the end when it's over. The problem is the muddle in the middle. All that real estate between the 20-yard lines. That's where the problem lies. But with a vision, it drives you to the finish line. The second quality of great leaders is they have the ability to communicate the vision. They can communicate it. The vision really is not all that important if you can't communicate it. So great leaders communicate. And the question is, how do they communicate? Well, I would say to you, first of all, they do it verbally. They communicate verbally. The very special leaders have done it with verbal gifts. I think of World War II, the dark days of World War II, Winston Churchill. His verbal skills kept that country alive. Edward R. Murrow was asked Churchill's greatest contribution to the war effort. He said he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle, said Murrow. And on the other side of the ocean, FDR, Roosevelt, was doing the same thing through his fireside chats. The civil rights movement of the 60s never would have happened without Dr. King's verbal skills to mobilize and move people into action. And Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, did it by speaking to people, and they listened to him, as did John Kennedy, as did Margaret Thatcher. The list goes on and on. But yet, when they list the things that people fear the most, far above death, far above spiders, far above snakes, far above an IRS investigation, far above a 60-minute truck parked in your driveway, is standing up in front of people and talking to them. That's the number one fear in the world. Tom Peters said about corporate folks, he said, being a pretty good speaker, he said, ain't good enough. So work on your verbal skills as leaders. But you know, there's something else we're communicating as leaders, and that is optimism. Great leaders communicate optimism. Ronald Reagan said optimism is a choice and one of the most powerful ones we can make. Colin Powell said perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. It just reverberates through an organization. Last Thursday, Peter Lowe had one of his success seminars here in Orlando, and Mayor Giuliani was one of the speakers, the featured speaker. And he stood up, he was talking about optimism in leadership. He said before 17,000 people, he said, if I stood before you and said, things are bad, real bad, and folks, they're going to get worse. I mean a whole lot worse. In fact, it's going to be terrible. Now follow me. He said, maybe 2 of you would, because you'd want an autograph. But he said the rest of you would have no interest. Katie Martin, the political writer, said in politics, optimism trumps pessimism every time. So as leaders, our optimistic outlook, and I'm not talking about out of touch with reality, rose-colored glasses, I'm saying an optimistic approach draws people. When Tommy Lasorda retired as the Dodger manager some years ago, I had a nice visit with him. 20 years managing the Dodgers. Think about that. And I asked Tommy what was the most important thing he did every day as the Dodger manager. I thought he would say making out my lineup card, getting the pitching staff rotation right, how I work my bullpen. Tommy said, most important thing I did every day was walk in the clubhouse right. He said it didn't matter whether we won 8 in a row or lost 8 in a row. Didn't matter whether things were great at home or not so great. He said the minute I walked in that clubhouse, my ball players had to see an upbeat, positive, optimistic manager. He said if they had seen my chin down at my belt buckle, he said that would have spread across my clubhouse like wildfire and destroyed the ball club, said Tommy. And optimism leads to hope. Great leaders communicate hope. Please understand, none of us can live a minute of the day without hope. That's why Napoleon said a leader is a dealer in hope. And I love the way the poet Emily Dickinson put it. She wrote, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And then there's one other thing I want to share with you that great leaders communicate, and that is motivation. It's part of the job description. 35 years in the NBA. You know what I'm still hoping for? Still longing for? A team where everybody on it is self-motivated. Oh, I'd be so thrilled when that happens. It hasn't happened yet. I don't know about your teams, but boy, I'm waiting for that day. I'll let you know when it happens. And I'm really hoping to have a family that's all self-motivated. I mean, 19 self-motivated children. Hasn't happened yet. I'm working on it. By the way, that year in which 16 of the kids were teenagers was quite a year. That was the year I realized why some animals eat their young. I bought into the Mark Twain philosophy of raising teenagers. Mark Twain said, when your child reaches 13, put them in a barrel, cut a hole in the barrel to feed them through. He said, at 16, seal up the hole, said Mark Twain. When 16 teenagers gather around a 16-foot-long dining room table in the morning for breakfast, it's not a pretty sight. And so in those days, I would do anything to get the teenage brain engaged. I went through a period of time where I would have a question of the morning. And so this particular morning at 6:30, my question was, kids, 20 years from now, what are you most going to remember about your old dad? Fathers understand that's a very risky question. You have no idea what's coming back. Well, they broke up into little buzz groups. I could hear them. Psst, 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 psst. Finally, David, one of the Filipino kids, and now one of the proud members of the United States Marine Corps, stationed on the windy, sandy terrain of Kuwait. David put his hand up and said, Dad, what we're most going to remember is that you were always motivating us. Oh, I laughed. They nailed it. Motivating them to do their homework. Motivating them to keep their rooms neat. Motivating them to play hard in sports. Motivating them to stay out of trouble. And I'm still doing it. Long distance. With emails and voicemails. And clippings. Yes, I have become a clipper. Just like my mother, all those years. And by the way, my mother, in the nursing home in Wilmington, Delaware, approaching her 89th birthday, still motivating me long distance, hoping that at some point, perhaps, her son will make it. The third quality of great leaders is that they have people skills. Great leaders have people skills. And I want to remind all of you today that you are not in the title insurance business any more than I am in the basketball business. We're all in the people business. That's what leaders do. They have a heart for people, they care for people, they have an empathy for people, they are interested in other people, all facets of their life. They're not just numbers on the board. They're just not pieces of the machinery, but great leaders have an intense interest in the overall lives of people. Jack Stallings was my college baseball coach. For 38 years he coached college baseball. I went to his retirement dinner, and at his retirement dinner he said, when I was a young graduate assistant at the University of North Carolina, the head coach said to me, Jack, you're not coaching baseball, you're coaching baseball players. And Coach Stallings said, I never forgot that. He said that really was the guiding light of my whole coaching career. So what are some people skills we can be working on as leaders? Here's one. Be visible and available to people. That comes to mind immediately. Tom Peters calls it managing by walking around. But long before Tom Peters was doing that, or talked about it, there was a man named Bill Veeck, the longtime Major League Baseball executive, who lived that way. He operated ball clubs in St. Louis and Chicago, Cleveland. Whenever Bill would buy a ball club, the first thing he did was remove the door from the hinges of his office. He just took it off. When he bought the White Sox the second time in the mid-'70s, he also had the walls taken down to his office. So his office had no walls, no door, was a table in the corner. You wanted to see him? He was sitting there for you to walk over and see. And he answered his own phone, picked it up and answered it, opened his own mail and answered his mail, roamed around the ballpark sitting with a different group of fans throughout the course of the game, stood at the gates as the game was over and shook your hand as you were leaving. And the next day, in all probability, he was speaking at your Rotary luncheon or your Kiwanis breakfast. Sure, he was hustling tickets, but that's how he operated, by being visible and available. The great leaders do that. There's a tendency in leadership to lock ourselves away from people, to stay up in an ivory tower. But I suggest to leaders, come on down and join the fray. Not necessarily you're going to hang out with the boys, and be one of them, but come on down and press the flesh. And in the process, you may learn something. I was in New York a few years ago, standing in line at the will call window, and a man standing right behind me was huge, blotted out the sun, about 6'5", 280 pounds. This guy was huge. And as we're standing there waiting to get our tickets to go to the Yankee game that night, I started talking to him. I discovered his name was David McMakin, and he played football at Alabama for Bear Bryant. So I was curious. I said, David, what's your most vivid memory of Coach Bryant? He thought for a minute and said, it was probably at the training table. When Coach Bryant would come and get in line, he was just the opposite of the assistants. They would all jump line after they got their tray and come down off the line and sit together in the corner. He said Coach Bryant never did that. He came in line like everybody else, came, got his food, stood at the end of the line, and he said you could see him peering all over the audience. And he said he would sit at a different table with a different group of guys every meal. David said, of course, we were praying it wouldn't be our table, he said. And here's another wonderful people skill to work on. It's called listening. Listening is a wonderful people skill, often neglected. I read an article in Time magazine a few years ago about the Pope, and one of his associates said, the Pope is a great listener. When you're sitting around the breakfast table with him in the morning having coffee, he said the Pope really goes out of his way to listen to you. And I said, how cool is that? I mean, one of the world's most prestigious positions, and he's a listener. By the way, do you remember any organization you belonged to where you heard this complaint about the top leader? If that woman would just stop listening so much, things would be better around here. Or if that man would just give up all this listening business, this company might... Ever heard that? I never have. And I don't think we ever will. The fourth quality of great leaders is they're men and women of character. Great leaders are men and women of character. And we've been in a national debate, have we not, over these last years about the character of our leaders. One school of thought was, as long as they're getting the job done and the economy is good, the character doesn't matter. The other school of thought is, you can't have one without the other. You got to have both. What does Norman Schwarzkopf have to say? Well, the general put it this way. He said, leadership consists of two qualities, two attributes, character and strategy. He said, if you have to do without one, he said, do without the strategy. So what are the character qualities we're looking for in great leaders? I'll tell you, the first thing that comes to my mind is honesty. That's what comes to me immediately, telling the truth. When the leader speaks, you can take her word to the bank. That's the first thing I would want. Abraham Lincoln, and we just celebrated his birthday. Abraham Lincoln was known as Honest Abe. You know, as you study Lincoln's life, it was true. Mary Lincoln once said, Mr. Lincoln was a monomaniac on honesty. And Lincoln himself said, my ability to keep my word is the gem of my character, he said. Colin Powell has many mementos of his long career in the military and government. One of his prized possessions at his home in Northern Virginia is a photograph of the general with Ronald Reagan. It's inscribed in the following manner. Colin, when you tell me something, I know it is so. Ronald Reagan. What a tribute. What an incredible tribute. Listen, may all of our photographs be autographed that way. And you see, honesty leads to integrity. Integrity in leadership simply means that there are no breaks in the circle, no chinks in the armor, no masks, no duplicity. What you see is what you get. Tom Peters said there are no minor lapses of integrity. In other words, you've got it or you don't. And if you're struggling in areas of integrity, may I encourage you to get it back. quickly, pull it together, and get it straightened out. Because if you lose your integrity, boy, it's almost impossible to retain it or get it back. I'm writing a book about Coach Wooden called How to Be Like Coach. Interesting process. He's almost 93 and still sharp as a tack. I'm interviewing all his former players and assistant coaches, media. I talked to one of his student managers who worked for him about 30 years ago at UCLA. And he said this about Coach Wooden. He said there was only one Coach Wooden. The Coach Wooden at practice was the same Coach Wooden in the locker room. The Coach Wooden in the locker room is the same Coach Wooden at home. The same John Wooden at home was the same John Wooden in the community. He said there was only one. And I thought, that's a good example, a good definition of integrity. The fifth thing I want you to know about leaders, great outstanding leaders, is that they are competent. They're good at what they do. And that begs the question, are great leaders born or are great leaders made? That debate has been raging for centuries. So I want to clean it up right now. How many fathers are here this evening? Put your hands up, please. Thank you. Second question, how many of you dads were in the birthing room when your child arrived? Just put your hand up, please. Great. Third question, how many of you remember the doctor handing you that 1-minute-old baby and looking at you and saying, Dad, looks like we got a natural-born leader here today? Any hands? No. Well, congratulations. I have been conducting that experiment across America many times. I have yet to see a hand raised. So I think it's safe to say that skills in leadership can be enhanced. They can be improved. Let me share 2 leadership skills we all need to work on. Courtesy of Chuck Daly, the longtime NBA coach who coached our Magic team in the late 90s. Chuck used to say, number one, he said, I'm not a coach. He said, I'm a salesman. He says, all I'm doing is selling all day long. I'm selling these ball players on strategy and matchup and game plans. Then I got to go sell our front office on what we're doing. Every time I talk to the media, I'm selling them so they can go sell the fans. He says, all I'm doing is selling for a living. And guess what? You are too. You're selling your product. You're selling yourself. You're selling. And as leaders, you're selling more than anybody else. And then Chuck said, secondly, I'm not a coach. He said, I'm a teacher. He said, even though these are the greatest athletes in the world, I'm teaching them fundamentals. I'm teaching them game plans. I'm teaching them strategy. I teach for a living. That's all I am doing. And you and I are doing the same thing as leaders. We're teaching as leaders in our home. We're teaching in the community. We're teaching in business. We're teachers. So just admit it. Maybe you didn't like your teachers back in school. He said, I'm never going to be a teacher. Well, guess what's happened? You're teaching. Oh, and by the way, you're going to be teaching for a lifetime. I mean, this never ends. And here's an interesting tidbit. You can't be a lifelong teacher till you commit to being a lifelong learner. You can't. And I'll tell you why. The modern era is generally considered to have started in 1500 AD. From 1500 AD to 1830, all known knowledge doubled. From 1830 to 1930, all known knowledge doubled again. Now, all known knowledge is doubling every 15 to 17 months. And that time frame is shortening as the years go on. Think about it. And if you're not on the cutting edge of learning, I want to tell you, you're going to fall by the wayside. You're going to fall right out of the parade, and you're not going to be able to compete. So how do you become a lifelong learner? Well, listen, I would encourage you to go back and get advanced degrees. Go for it. You can do it. I mean, through distance learning, go get your master's degree. Go get a PhD. I mean, I've always thought it would be cool to be Dr. Pat Williams. Maybe at some point, listen, I want to go for it. But in the meantime, here's a wonderful suggestion on how to learn. It's called reading. It's a marvelous way to learn. Your mind is a muscle like any other muscle in the human body, and if it's not exercised on a vigorous basis, it'll turn into a pitiful mass of flab in an incredibly brief period of time. The Nautilus and Hammer Strength people have not yet come up with equipment to attach to this muscle, although they're working on it. But until they perfect it, The best device that hooks here is called a book. Therefore, starting tomorrow, even though you've got a full day, and even though you're not allowed to be a tad late, starting tomorrow, I'm going to challenge you tomorrow and every day the rest of your life to read 1 hour a day from a book that you get to choose. In other words, they're not assigned. Good news, you pick them. Subjects that you're interested in. Newspapers, magazines, trade journals, periodicals, comic books, pulp novels, they don't count. Do that on your time, not mine. It can be one 60-minute session, 2 30s, 4 15s, 3 20s, 6 10s, 10 6s, 32 61s. I don't care how you do the hour. At the end of 1 week, you'll have finished a book. Keep in mind, the average man, upon graduating from college, will not finish another book the rest of his life. 85% of all books in this country are purchased by women. But at the end of 1 week, folks, 1 week, you'll have finished a book. At the end of 1 year, you'll have read 52 books. Keep in mind, if you read 5 books on any one subject, you'll be considered a world-leading authority on that subject. 1 year from tonight, you'll be a world-leading authority on 10 different subjects. 10 years from today, you'll have read 520 books that you pick. You'll be a world-leading authority on 100 different subjects 10 years from tonight. Think about it. How exciting is that? By reading an hour a day in fields that you're interested in. Now, will that make a difference in your life? Will that impact everything you do? Will that enhance your earning capacity? Will that make you the most fascinating lunchtime companion in your community? Will people be begging to take you to Olive Garden for lunch? Eager to pick up the tab. And I'll tell you in advance what their only complaint will be. I could not take it all in. I mean, I only brought a thimble to lunch today with you. I should have brought a wash basin because there was so much pouring out. I just could not take it all in. Listen, the answer to all of those questions is yes, 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 and yes. The average American watches 4 hours of television every night. The average American also reads 250 words a minute. Therefore, according to historian David McCullough, if you turn that television set off and devote that to reading, at the end of 1 week, you'll have read all the poems of Maya Angelou. You'll have read all the poems of T.S. Eliot. You will have read 2 Thornton Wilder plays, including Our Town. You will have read The Great Gatsby, and you will have read all 150 Psalms in the Old Testament by reading those hours instead of watching television, and all of that will happen in 1 week. Think about it. Read, read, read. The 6th quality of great leaders is they have boldness. Great leaders have boldness. They listen carefully, they gather information, they deliberate, but when it's time to make a decision, they make the decision and move on. Ronald Reagan was talking about his leadership style, and he said, I did listen to my counselors. He says, but when it was time to make a decision, he said, I made the decision. He said, I did not take a vote, said Ronald Reagan. And as I think about our current president in Washington, with all the burdens of world leadership on his shoulders, he's gathering information, he's deliberating, he's listening carefully, but at some point he's going to have to make a very, very bold decision. Lee Iacocca was asked if he could have one quality only in leadership, what would it be? He said decisiveness. And I'll never forget at that press conference at the start of Desert Storm, there was General Schwarzkopf talking to the media, and one of them asked, what kind of a leader are you? What's your style? And he simply said, when in command, he said, I take charge, said Stormin' Norman. We kind of miss him, don't we? I mean, how can we go to war maybe with Iraq without General Schwarzkopf? And T. Boone Pickens, the Texas businessman, said, I can't stand leaders who won't make a decision. He said, it's the ready, aim, aim, aim syndrome. He said, at some point, you've got to fire. And speaking of firing, I was in New Orleans a few years ago, had the morning free. I went to that new D-Day museum in downtown New Orleans that Stephen Ambrose helped get started. Powerful experience as you just relive the Normandy invasion. I mean, it'll really impact you. I was particularly fascinated with a little alcove dedicated to General Eisenhower himself and that momentous decision that faced him. You see, they'd made the decision actually to start the invasion earlier in June, but the weather was so bad they couldn't do it. Finally, by the 5th of June, they had the men loaded onto the boats, and they were getting ready to go across the English Channel, but the weather was just frightful. And so there were 14 subordinate generals. Eisenhower brought them all together, outlined everything, brought in the weather prognosticator, a man named Stagg, to get his take on it. He said, after the 6th of June, it's going to get worse. So the only little window of weather was the 6th of June, even though it was bad, real bad. So on the night of the 5th, Eisenhower had a poll. They split 7-7. And everybody in the room knew that Eisenhower was going to have to make the call. There was total silence in that room. You talk about pressure, tension. Finally, Eisenhower quietly said this, "Okay, we'll go." Within 5 minutes, the room had emptied. Orders had been cut. The invasion was to be launched the next day. Eisenhower later said, it was the most helpless feeling I've ever had in my life. He said, the minute I made that decision, he said, it was out of my hands. He said, all I could do was pray. And the next day, the Normandy invasion started. And history was altered, and the world has never been the same, really because of one man's bold decision. And then there's a final quality I've discovered with great leaders, and that is they have a servant's heart. The very special leaders have a servant's heart. You might find that paradoxical, that we go from boldness, when in command I take charge, to a servant's heart. I want to tell you the good news, you can have both. Now, not a lot have both, but when you come across a servant leader, Joseph in the Old Testament was a servant leader. While in prison, it says the prison guard put him in charge of the other prisoners, and Joseph served them. Imagine, 13 years down in a dungeon, he's serving the other prisoners. Jesus was a servant leader. Albert Schweitzer was a servant leader. Dr. King was a servant leader. Mother Teresa. Eleanor Roosevelt. Adlai Stevenson said of her, when Eleanor Roosevelt walked past a starving man, she felt his hunger. I was in Kansas City a few years ago speaking at an Amway convention. We're owned, by the way, by the DeVos family, the Amway people. So if you've never been to an Amway rally, it's 1/3 Mardi Gras, 1/3 Billy Graham Crusade, and 1/3 Notre Dame pep rally. That's an Amway convention. I had the morning free, so I went out to run. I was running down Main Street in Kansas City. I got to the corner of 40th and Main in this 4-lane highway. In the middle, right there at that corner, was a little park, and in the park was a monument. I'm a sucker for monuments. Oh, I've got to check them out. So I went into the middle of the highway to see what this was about. I'm glad I did, because I read that this monument was dedicated to a man named Major Murray Davis, who was from Kansas City, and I learned that he was killed on September 28, 1918, during World War I in Exermont, France. On the other side of the monument, it was engraved in the following manner. As he lay mortally wounded, after leading his troops to victory, his last words were, "Take care of my men," it said. And I thought, wow, that man was a servant leader. I wish I could have known him. We've learned that great teams have outstanding talent. They have outstanding leadership. The third thing we need to know about great teams is that they are committed. They have made a commitment. That's what great teams have done. And you ask me, committed to what? Well, first of all, committed to each other. Great teams have made a commitment within the fiber of their being to each other. Secondly, great teams have made a commitment to excellence, operational excellence. I'm thrilled to see that up there. I mean, that takes a commitment or you're never going to have excellence. So when I tell you that we're all going to dinner tomorrow night, courtesy of the brass at Land America at Ruth Chris's, that's what's going to happen. I mean, what's your immediate reaction? You're going to have the finest meal you can have, right? I mean at the highest level of quality, because somewhere little old Ruth Fertig made a commitment to excellence, and they've carried it right on even after her death. And if I say weekend at Disney, it's going to be quality, isn't it? High level, because 40 years ago, 50 years ago, Walt Disney said, anything I do is going to be at the highest level of excellence. And they've carried it right on through, because Walt believed in that. So there's a commitment to excellence. There's a third commitment, and that is to competing. Great teams have made a commitment to compete. I don't know your business. I've got to tell you, I know very little about the title insurance business. Can I ask you a question? And please don't laugh at me. Is it competitive? Oh, good. All right. There's lots of competition. All right. Okay. Well, there sure is in my business. When our season started this year, we opened with the 76ers and beat them. But I was so nervous. I was so nervous before the start of the season. It happens every year. Do you know what the other 28 teams in the league would love to have happen to the Orlando Magic? 0-82. I mean, 0-82. Just grind us into powder, scatter us to the four winds, and they couldn't care less. Whew. That is intimidating. It really is. I mean, it's all about competition. I mean, everywhere I go, competition, and it never ends. So what are we going to do about our competition? I've thought long and hard about this one. Well, let me tell you some things not to do. Don't use arsenic on their executives. Okay, it's not worth it. Don't go do any damage to their buildings. Don't mess with their automobiles while they're parked. Please don't do that. I mean, it's taken 40 years for me to figure this out, but there's only one thing you can do about your competition and I can do about mine, and that is welcome it. That's our only alternative. Welcome your competition, because it's the competition that makes you better. It's the competition that drags out of us that which we should be doing anyway, but we don't do it till the competition makes us do it. Joe Paterno said, I love my competition. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be as good as I am. And Bella Caroli, who coached our women's Olympic gymnastics teams for years, in his rolling Romanian accent said, no competition. He said, no progress. By the way, it was also Bella who said, two things I hate, laziness and lousiness, he said. I do a radio show here in Orlando. A few years ago, I interviewed Joe Falls, the longtime Detroit newspaper man, and on the show he said, on Joe DiMaggio's 70th birthday, I called him up out in California, talked to him for a half hour, wished him happy birthday. He talked to me for 30 minutes, a half hour. He said, the next spring, I was at the Red Sox training camp, then in Winter Haven, standing around the batting cage with Ted Williams. And he said, I told Ted about my session that winter with Joe DiMaggio. As I was walking away, Ted started screaming at me. He said, hey, Bush, he said, you call me on my 70th birthday. He said, I'll give you an hour. And Joe Falls said on the radio, can you believe it? He said, Williams and DiMaggio, competing in the 1930s, competing in the 1940s, competing in the 1950s, and here they are, two old men, he said, still competing with each other. And why do we compete? What's the big deal? Well, that's the fourth commitment that great teams make. They're committed to winning. It's all about winning, folks, and please don't apologize for that. I mean, in our business, they have a very strange custom. If after a certain period of time you have not produced enough W's, they slide you right off the stage, and here comes somebody else to take your place, hopeful they can produce W's. I mean, it happens every year in the National Football League after the last regular season game, and it's always the week before Christmas. Minimum 5, maximum 7 or 8 NFL coaches are fired like that with their staffs, Christmas or no Christmas. You know why? Too many L's, not enough W's. So every morning that you get out of bed, Your feet hit the ground. You got to say, what am I going to do today to help Land America produce more W's today? It's that simple. Never lose sight of that. I learned that lesson very early in my career. After my first year with the 76ers, I was working in the front office, 29 years old. It was summertime. The phone rang. It was our owner, a man named Irv Kozloff, who could be very direct, very incisive. He said, how are things going, Pat? And I had a way of dealing with him. Fantastic, Coz. They're really going well. They're just going terrific. He said, what's that mean? Well, I tried to explain to him what we were doing. And he says, let me tell you something. And I've never forgotten this. He said, you've got to ask yourself 2 questions every minute of every day the rest of your career if you're going to be in this business. Number 1, what are you doing right now to help the 76ers win more games? And number 2, what are you doing right now to help the 76ers sell more tickets? And he said, if you're not doing one of those 2 things, you're on a side road, you're heading in the wrong direction, get yourself back in the main highway. That's what this business is about. I've never forgotten it. The 4th quality of great teams is that they have passion. Great teams are passionate about what they do. You get a whole organization of passionate people, upbeat, excited, passionate people. I want to tell you, that team can't be beat. Even if your talent level is a little lower, you're not going to ever beat passion. I'm often asked about qualities of my children. I mean, people ask all the time, are there any common traits that all these children have? Some are from Asia, some from Europe, some from South America. We have Brazilians, Filipinos, Romanians, South Koreans, homegrown. I mean, any common traits. Oh, I laugh and I tell them, oh yes, there is one very dominant trait of all of them. Everything in their life is related to how cool it is. That's the number 1 trait. I mean, although the word now is fat. P-H-A-T, to you great unwashed. That means pretty hot and tempting. I mean, is it fat or is it not fat? And I've discovered with my children the most unfat thing in the world is to be too excited, too enthusiastic, too passionate about anything. Because in the eyes of the peer group, that would not be fat. So therefore, you major and specialize in chilling and vegging. Because that's considered really cool. Not to a type A father, but to the teenage world, that is real cool. So we chill and we veg a great deal. One of the deals I have with my children, and they know this from the time they're very young, on the night of high school graduation, the party is over. They move in one of 3 directions, and it's not staying home. They go to college, which means summer school. Number 2, they go into the military. 2 of the boys have been in the Marine Corps. Or number 3, they go to work, which generally means McDonald's or Walmart. My children are discovering very quickly that the professors at the University of Florida, the drill chiefs at Parris Island, or the crew chiefs at McDonald's could not care less how fat they are. My children are discovering that Coach Lombardi was right, that the difference between success and failure is energy. And Coach Lombardi was right when he said, if you're not fired with enthusiasm, you will be fired with enthusiasm. And by the way, very early in the book, How to Be Like Mike, you are going to read about his passion. You're going to read about his energy. You are going to read about his enthusiasm. You don't know why? You want to know why Mike is special? You don't want to know why at 40 years of age, he went for 43 the other night? Think about that for a minute. This is the most passionate, intense human being ever to walk the face of the earth. I mean, he is into it, never takes a day off, whether it's a practice, whether it's a game, whether it's a blowout. I don't care what is going on. He is passionate about what he's doing. And I talked to almost all of his old former Bulls teammates, and you know what they all said? You think Michael was passionate in the games? They said, you should have seen him at practice. They should have charged admission to practice. That's where you really saw Michael. because they all said he got greater delight out of whipping up on us than he did the other team. It gave him more satisfaction to slaughter us every day than the opposition. Now, I want to suggest, folks, you get men and women that passionate on your organization and your teams, you think that's going to make a difference? Think that's going to absolutely ignite your company? The answer, of course, is yes. So no fat stuff going on at Land America. I mean, we're not allowed to be cool at Land America. I mean, we're in it every day. Now, you all have a big night of team building exercises tonight. I hope you're rested. I hope you're ready. We're going to have a little book signing out here in the hall. I'm looking forward to that. And then you're into your team building exercises. However, before that happens, I want to tell you about the 8th quality of great teams. The 8th quality of great teams is they're made up of men and women of character. I touched very lightly on it with leadership, but let me tell you what I'm saying. When Dallas Green was managing the Phillies, go ahead, let me hear you guys. Thank you. When Dallas Green was managing the Phillies, they won a pennant in the World Series in 1980, only one they've ever won. Dallas Green, a big man, 6'5", 280 pounds, I guess, give or take a few Krispy Kremes. And I can still hear his booming voice saying, "We need some character people on this team," said Dallas. And for 20 plus years, I have been trying to figure out what is the makeup of character people. What do character people have that makes them character people? Well, I touched on honesty, talked about that with leadership, talked about integrity. Those are 2 qualities of character people on teams. There's a 3rd quality I've discovered with character people. That is, they have maturity. They've grown up. That's a big word in our household, by the way. I mean, I hear that all the time now. "Dad, I'm mature, right? Can I have the car this weekend?" Or I'll have a 17-year-old daughter saying, "I'm mature, right, Dad? Can I go to the beach with my boyfriend this week?" No. So we've got a little plumb line definition on maturity in our house. When the little girl or the little boy has decided to sit down permanently, and the young man and the young lady has decided to stand up permanently, pretty good sign we've got some maturity going on. I'm discovering that maturity really isn't related to age. I mean, there's some very mature 17-year-olds and some very immature 47-year-olds, but great character people have maturity. Character people also take responsibility. They have honesty, integrity, they have maturity, they take responsibility. No blame game. This was done well and I did it, this was done poorly and I did it. That's what character people do. We are living, however, in the age of the spin doctor. I make a decision, it works out, I'm responsible. I make a decision, it doesn't work out, I hire a spin doctor to try and portray why I'm not responsible. Oh, there's some strange stuff going on out there. But character people say, I'm responsible. Character people work hard. Character people put shoe leather to the pavement every day. And they get out of bed and put their work boots on. I'm struggling with this current generation, including my children. They don't get it. I mean, it really worries me. They don't get it. I was speaking in Minneapolis a few years ago. A man came up after the luncheon and said, "Can I take you to the airport?" He said, "I got to talk to you." I said, "Okay, what do you want to talk about?" He said, "I got to talk about my son." I said, "Well," as we got in the car, I said, "Tell me about your son." He said, "Well, he's 13 years old, loves basketball, just loves it. And he wants to go to the University of Minnesota and play ball there." I said, "Well, that's a great idea. What's the problem?" He says, "Well, he wants to know now that he's got a scholarship because he doesn't want to do all the work and end up not getting a scholarship." I said, "Sir, may I explain this to you? College coaches are not awarding 13-year-old scholarships in advance to give them incentive to work hard so they can play." I said, "It doesn't work that way. You put the work in, you develop, you pay the price, and then you get the rewards, okay? And our current generation, because I live with them, they're not getting it. Somewhere or other, we've dropped the ball. Character people have perseverance. Rich DeVos, the owner of our basketball team, said perseverance is stubbornness with a purpose. You hang in there. At the first sign of adversity, you don't belly up and quit. Walt Disney called it stick-to-it-ivity. It's a made-up word. Don't go running to the dictionary and look it up. I shared that word, by the way, with a Florida Gator the other day. He came back to me 2 days later. He was so excited. He said, for the first time, I realized the dictionary's in alphabetical order. The guy was just thrilled. And he said, boy, this is going to save time. I mean, the guy was really, really happy. I love to read. And as I read biographies, there's one common trait with every person I've ever read about in every biography, no matter what time, no matter what period of history. And it's simply this. They all had about 18 opportunities when they could have quit and should have quit. I mean, everything had gone against them. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, it was hopeless, it appeared, but they just wouldn't do it. They tunneled through, pole vaulted over, dynamited their way underneath, but they did whatever they had to keep on going when they should have and could have quit. And had they, we never would have heard of them. Like Michael. I mean, you've heard that story. He got cut as a sophomore at Laney High School in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was devastated. Went home, spent the whole weekend in tears. His mother finally said, Michael, you're going to have to do something here and decide what you want to do. So Michael played JV ball. The next summer, Michael grew 6 inches. Keep in mind, the late James Jordan was 5'8". Mother Dolores is average size. Brother Larry is 5'8". Michael has grown to 6'6". Whew. And then went on. You know, he played as a junior, played as a senior in high school, and the rest is history. And I think that's why Derek Jeter of the Yankees said not long ago, if Michael Jordan had quit in high school, they would never have named a shoe after him. And character people have a humble spirit. Character people have humility. It's the most beautiful of all qualities. Frank Wells, for many years, was the president of Disney. He was Michael Eisner's partner until he was killed in a tragic helicopter skiing accident on the back slopes of Utah. As his family was going through his personal possessions, his son came across his dad's wallet. In the wallet was a piece of paper folded over many times, one sentence written on the paper. It said, humility is the essence of life. Humility is the essence of life. A little footnote. Back in the early 80s when Disney was restructuring, the board of directors had hired Frank Wells as the CEO first. They later discovered that Michael Eisner was available from Paramount, but he was only interested in the job if he could be the CEO, the top guy. They went to Frank Wells nervously, and Frank Wells said, hire him. I'll take the second spot, hire Michael Eisner. Together, we'll make it work. Whew, talk about humility in action. And you know, they did make it work magnificently. And the death of Frank Wells, frankly, they've never recovered because he had a humble spirit. And I want to tell you one other thing about character people. They're men and women of courage. Character people are men and women of courage. Now, we generally think of courage, do we not, of physical acts of bravery? We all have many memories of September 11th. We'll never forget it. You know my most vivid image? It was a television interview with a businessman who had gotten out of the building. He was standing on the sidewalk covered with soot and dust. You could hardly see his eyes. The television cameramen were talking to him. And with this wide-eyed, frantic look on his face, he looked over at the building that was collapsing. And he said, as we were coming down, they, meaning the firemen, were going up. And then he looked at the camera and said, and they had no fear on their faces. Whew. Well, I'll tell you what, they had fear in their hearts. They had to. I mean, courage is not the absence of fear, but it's dealing with fear. John Wayne said, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. And we got to fight and battle our fears and move on with courage. But you know, courage is not just a fireman going up into a building, or those troops that we saw in Saving Private Ryan storming the beaches at Normandy. Courageous as that is, courage happens every day in our lives when people don't even see it, don't even notice it. Two of our sons are twins from South Korea, Thomas and Stephen. They graduated from high school, and old Pop had to live up to his admonition. The night of high school graduation, one of three things happens. Well, these were college kids. They were good students. And so Thomas went to the University of Florida. Stephen went to Florida State. That was interesting to begin with. It was my assignment to drive Stephen, then 17, up to summer school at Florida State in Tallahassee, a 4-hour drive up through the state of Florida. I gathered up all his possessions, got him in the car. We headed on up to Florida State. Got there, I took him to dinner, found his dorm room, met his roommate, got him all straightened out, made sure he had his classes lined up. And about 8:30 in the evening, I got in my car and it was time to head home. And old tough Pop had a big lump in his throat. And some tears were coming down the edge of his eyes, and I started to pray. And my prayer was very simple. Lord, this little kid I've just left back here, would you please give him the courage when all his newfound buddies are saying, hey, Steve, let's go do this, or let's go give this a try, and he knows it's the wrong thing. I said, Lord, will you give him the courage to stand up for what he knows is right and make the right decisions and move in the right direction? Will you please give him that courage? Ladies and gentlemen, that should be our prayer as well. Thank you, folks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. You're very kind. Thank you, thank you. Thank you.